Hey, welcome to the Elixir Roundtable. I'm Nathan Long. I'm a senior software engineer at Dockyard.
I'm Adam Phillips. I'm an engineering manager here at Dockyard.
I'm Chris McCord, and Nathan forgot to say where the tables are definitely round. I'm a staff engineer at Fly.io and an advisor for Dockyard.
My name is Mike Benz. I'm a senior software engineer at Dockyard.
So I think first up on our discussion today, we've got a few different topics, but the first thing up is Phoenix 1.6. Chris, you want to give us kind of the rundown?
Sure. Yeah, there's an article on the Phoenix website and on the Elixir forum. I just copy pasted it. So yeah, it was released at like midnight last night, so like it should be fresh in my head, but I'm also on less sleep than normal. So anyone here can tell me if I missed anything, which actually Nathan did remind me I did miss a big feature in the changelog. Anyway, so the big stuff with Phoenix 1.6 is around a few things. So one is we have some new generators. We have a new HTML-aware template engine. And along with the Phoenix 1.6 release was a new like major live view release that came out last week that I kind of like soft released, didn't announce it just because they kind of go hand in hand. But on the generator side, there's authentication generators that have been around for a long time as a hex package, but Aaron Renner did the work to take Jose's initial authentication implementation, make it into a package, and then we put that task inside of Phoenix, and it basically bootstraps an entire like user system, forgot password, email delivery inside your app without being like a library. So Jose has a great blog on the Dashbit blog that talks about why we went this route, but instead of trying to like shoehorn a broad authentication solution as a library, it inevitably breaks down. We took the approach of we'll give you a security audited, well-tested authentication solution that we generate into your app, and then your team can extend that. So like there's just a mix Phoenix gen.auth. You kind of give it a few options, like the module that you want the interface to live under, and we just generate all that into your app, and it's like a turnkey solution that then you can extend. There's some mailer generators as well. So we always say that Phoenix has like the 80% use case of web apps covered, but we've ignored like the fact that people need to send email, which falls under that 80%. It's just not something that we wanted to own, but that's finally in there as like a mixed Phoenix Gen notifier task, and we include the swoosh library by default to send email. You can opt out of that with a no mailer flag, but by default you get the ability to send email, which basically anyone building anything user facing needs. So before people complain, you can opt out of it, and also you're going to need it anyway. So in addition to the generators, we have a HEEX templates. So we went from HTML EEX to HTML LEEX for like live EEX, and then we went to a new template or new .html HEEX HEEX, which is an HTML aware template syntax that provides some syntax conveniences inside of live view. And the reason why we didn't just take leaks and add that was it is a more stricter syntax. So there's certain things, since we parse HTML, that you can't do. Like you can't do arbitrary Elixir EX expressions inside like an opening and closing HTML tag, because when we're parsing that, technically you could just inject any string you want and like close the tag, and that's impossible for us to know that it's valid or not. So we have a new kind of React style template syntax when you're inside an HTML tag only. Regular EX rules apply outside of that, but we needed a new template engine. We couldn't just reuse leaks because it'd be a breaking change. So some leaks templates out there need a small amount of work to make them HEEX compatible, but that's why we introduced yet another extension. But like the HEEX is nice because it's like HTML. And the other big part of that is we are standardizing on HEEX templates for any HTML that you're going to use in Phoenix. So you can render HEEX templates without using live view and just return a string of HTML. So this is nice to share templates between your dead views and your live views, because now everything's a HEEX template. It's not this like weird duality where people would be unsure how they shared templates around. So I encourage folks to check that out. We give like an example of what the template syntax looks like, but essentially it's like the tag becomes a function call. So you can just say like, open tag mymodule.badge, and it renders a badge. Or if you import that function into the lexical scope, you can use like opentag.badge as like a local function call. So really, it's a convenience around calling a EX component function, but it makes your markup look much nicer, because otherwise the problem with LiveView previously was the more components you used, you kind of lost the structure of the actual markup that you were building. So it's a really nice quality of life improvement on that side. In addition to that, we had some big LiveView features. One is live sessions, which is kind of optimized page navigation. So previously we would have to do an HTTP round trip when you clicked a link, and then we would do a WebSocket connection. So you would pay like a latency penalty. Now we do all navigation over the existing WebSocket connection. So it's going to be like faster than any other framework that's doing kind of like the PJAX style or TurboLink style navigation, because they're still doing the HTTP handshake, where we have a WebSocket connection and we just send like a single WebSocket frame, and then it's going to replace your live view and do a push state behind the scenes. So you're going to get even speedier live view experience using this live session based navigation. In addition to that, go ahead.
Sorry, is that different from like live redirect that we had previously?
That is a great question. So it applies when you use live redirect. So live redirect previously would incur extra round trip to the server, because we would have to go fetch some signed data behind the scenes. So it's still like live redirects in your template or from the live view still work just like they used to. They're just going to be twice as fast latency wise, which is pretty neat. What else did we do? Oh, we added, Michael Crum added the idea of lifecycle hooks on the server to live view, which is like a heavily requested feature. So like imagine you want to do authentication on mount. Well, before we would tell you to write a function and call it in everywhere and on mount, and that can get tedious, but it worked. Now you can actually say like on mount, call this function, and that function composes with other on mount hooks, and any of those can halt or continue. So it's kind of like similar to like a plug idea. So you can add lifecycle hooks to enforce authentication on mount, and then specify that in the router one time, kind of like a browser pipeline, instead of repeating this code everywhere. But we do that for mount, not only mount, but basically all the lifecycle callbacks. So if you want to run code for handle event or before handle info, you can start to compose and hook into these lifecycle events. So if you have like a library that says like, well, on your live view, I'm going to add this functionality, but I need to be able to receive messages over PubSub on handle info if they match this server. Now you can library in mount, you could just call attach hook. You pass that library's function, and then it handles all those details internally. So when you receive a handle info message, it will pick it up. If it matches what it cares about, it will handle it. It can halt, it can do whatever it wants. So I think this is going to be a really powerful feature for people wanting to hook into, events coming in, doing PubSub stuff, or just like standard authentication on mount. And what I forgot to add to the changelog that Nathan reminded me is we've talked about it before, but we replaced Node and Webpack with ESBuild for new projects. So you get a node list, like Node doesn't have to be on the system, or doesn't have to be, but if it's on the system, we're not using it. And we can bundle your JavaScript and CSS with a portable Go binary. The nice thing about that is you don't have to install Node and deal with breaking changes, but also this portable binary is going to be essentially guaranteed to work years from now. So you fire up a project, a client comes in, as we're used to in Dockyard. Actually, the most recent client that we worked on, the only issues that we had getting their application stood up was Node and Webpack related, as it turns out. So all of that kind of falls away. It's like if you're using ESBuild for JavaScript and CSS, it should essentially just work for the foreseeable future, which is what you want for maintainable software. So that's a big win in my book. And like running the generator, people are going to see how fast it is. Like what we do when it starts up is we'll go download the portable binary for your platform from the internet, and then we run it, but it does it in like instantly. So it's like, it almost looks like it doesn't work, because you run Mixed Phoenix server after starting a new project, and it's just like downloading ESBuild, JavaScript built, and you're like, wait, what? like, you know, Webpack used to like sit for a while, and then like three seconds later, it'd be like, oh, it built all this stuff. Now it's like carriage return. As soon as Phoenix logs that it's running, it downloads the Go binary and it's built your JavaScript before you can process what's happening. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, that's essentially the 1.6 release candidate and the 0.16 library release in a, I don't know, what was that, 8-minute brained up. Any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, is there anything that you give up with using ESBuild that you can't do anymore in terms of capabilities? Sounds like it's faster and easier to work with. What's
yeah, there
the
absolutely are. I'm not like this is one of the reasons why like Webpack was in retrospect it didn't pan out, because how many years has myself and the Phoenix team been using Webpack along multiple versions, and I'm still like I still barely know how to get it to work right for what I'm trying to do. So I think absolutely it's not going to be an easy fit for a lot of people if they're doing really complex JavaScript development with a lot of dependencies. Like Webpack has this idea of loaders that allows you to hook in and do all kinds of stuff. If you're using Babel to transpile to like really old JavaScript versions, there's a lot that people can be doing with Webpack that ESBuild may not provide for you easily. So I don't want to say it's a perfect solution, but at the same time, so let's restart. Anecdotally, like if you're just writing standard JavaScript, CSS, you want them bundled and minified, ESBuild is just going to work for you and be great. This includes live view apps all the way up to, you know, even React applications. So I think you can take it pretty far. I just don't want people to have a false sense that it will just work. But the anecdote that we have on the Phoenix team is Michael Crum works at CargoSense. They have a sizable React application that was taking like 45 seconds to build. Their Webpack was taking 45 seconds to build the JavaScript bundle on any change, which is pretty crazy. And he added ESBuild, got it down to like 7 seconds with ESBuild, building a React app, which is, you know, obviously non-trivial. So I think it could work, but it may require some trial and error, and it may have something that, you know, just doesn't fit your needs. But I encourage folks to try it out, especially given if you have really slow Webpack builds, it may be a pretty big win.
That's cool. Yeah, on the project that I work on, our JavaScript usage is pretty simple, but we still have had a lot of pain with Node. So we're excited to try this out.
Yeah, and the upgrade guides that I linked in the announcement have the optional step-by-step instructions to get the ESBuild solution in place from your existing. So I think, yeah, it's important to say the existing Webpack configuration will just work. Like Phoenix has always been build tool agnostic. You just told it what CLI command to run and your like wxs endpoint config. So like if you want to still continue to use Webpack, by all means, if it suits your needs, go for it. But if you want to give ESBuild a shot, we do have instructions linked in the announcement.
Cool. Anybody else have questions right now or thoughts?
No, I was going to ask. I was going to ask about something like Tailwind, but looks actually like that's going to be pretty trivial to roll over as well.
Yeah. So Jose, I actually plan. I will go back and link this in the step-by-step instructions. I plan on linking. Jose put just a personal repo together showing how to use like Tailwind. So what you can do is you run ESBuild, but you also run an additional Tailwind CLI watcher as part of your Phoenix watchers. So Phoenix just starts a Tailwind CLI and ESBuild, and they both play nice together. So if you wanted to use Tailwind, that can still work as well. Obviously, you'll have to still do an npm install and get Tailwind and still have a node modules directory, but there's still a happy path there. And I think it's worth mentioning, I think we didn't talk about this on a previous episode, but the nice thing with ESBuild is in the generated app.js, we kind of tell people they can either, you know, add a dependency to their vendored asset directory and import it directly, or to just use Node, they can just go to their assets directory, do an npm install foo-bar, and then ESBuild is aware of node modules by default. So like your upgrade path, if you say like, well, I've got all this like it's great that you don't need Node, but I need Node, right? A lot of people need Node packages. The path to go from what we generate to using Node is literally just cd assets npm install like you normally would, and then esbuild just picks it up. There's no like configuration file for esbuild to write. It just knows about it, and you can just start using Node if you need Node. So I think that's a great question, Adam. It's important to highlight that it still plays nice. It's not like, oh, well, great, I can stay away from Node, but I need Node, and now I have to go to Webpack. Like it's still can use in both worlds.
Mike, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, no, I was just saying I was interested to dive in. I haven't had a chance to dig into it. It's interesting that a tag is a function. Does that mean that the attributes that you pass into that tag get passed into the function? As how's that magic?
Yeah,
work?
so the attributes, the tag attributes are just assigns to the function call. So the function components are just functions that receive assigns, which are what you're, a map of key values like you're used to. And then the job of the function is to return a sigil H Heeks template. And you can just use those assigns within that template. So the caveat here is we only support stateless function components with the special tag syntax at the moment. Part of that is it's actually currently it's an arbitrary restriction, but there is a cost to stateful components if you're on the server. It's like they're stateful, so they require you to hold state. So we don't want people to write a bunch of accidental stateful things because they want the tag to look pretty. Like if you're coming from React, especially, people are used to creating like mini nested trees of components for like all kinds of things. So right now, this template syntax is reserved for just stateless function calls. So if you want a stateful component that can do like handle event and receive messages from the client, hold its own state, you're still going to have to call a live component. So the syntax is reserved for these stateless function calls.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not a live component replacement or drop-in type thing. This is for really smaller chunks of code.
Yeah, exactly. So like you can still componentize things, and your live components can be made up of these function components that are reusable and badges that you want to show. But the dynamic part of like the stateful components currently, you have to use the uglier syntax, and at the moment that's intentional to I guess like there should be some thought there. Like when in my template, I want it should be clear that what I'm doing has a cost versus like, oh, this is a table, right? Like there's a big difference there. Like if it's just spitting out HTML or if it's actually having this pseudo process on the server that takes memory. So right now it's an intentional, I guess, limitation.
Gotcha. That helps figure out where it could be used.
When it says
so my goal, sorry, Nathan, my goal long term is like so the Phoenix generators largely the live generators are largely the same, except they'll use, instead of form for, we have a form function. So this is a great example of like we've got if you generate like mixed Phoenix Gen live posts, right, like a blog post CRUD interface in live view, the form component that renders that CRUD interface is still a module that we call live component on, but it uses internally a form .form imported function. So form for has been replaced with a stateless Heeks function, and you get like the form syntax, and if that makes sense. So you can still compose much of your app inside live components with these building blocks that have a nice syntax. So it's not like, I think it still has a broad use case. It's just for the actual top level component that is stateful, you're going to be calling live component.
It says that Heeks will parse and validate the HTML structure. What is it? Is it just like if you open a tag, you have to close it, or is it like I know that div is valid and aside is valid, but foo is not valid?
No, it's basically open closing tag type stuff.
Okay, so could you maybe write XML with this if you wanted to?
Yeah, sure. Like we're very liberal in what we allow. Like it needs to just look like valid XML essentially.
Okay, cool. Because I'm gonna write XML with it. I'm just kidding.
I mean, go for it. That should work. And I think like
just don't.
Yeah, I linked in. Also, I linked in the announcement. There's the Heeks roadmap is an issue on LiveView. So this is kind of like laying the groundwork for like this is where I was going with this earlier. My eventual goal for the live generators are more higher level components. Like right now we just have the form, but the goal would be the table that we list of your posts or whatever your resource was. I'd like that for that to be a component. So eventually we'll have kind of like, the goal is eventually off the shelf components for like, I want to render a table, let's say it's a function, right, that you call like dot table as a tag. But that behind the scenes could be using Tailwind. So I think there's some really neat ideas. We still have to like experiment and prove them out. But imagine if out of the box, the live generators generated the CRUD code you have now, but built off of form components, table components. And then you could be like, well, I want to use Bootstrap or I want to use Tailwind, but the same components existed, right? So you could almost like swap in themes, so to speak, and largely not have to go change classes everywhere, just on the component themselves. So I think that's like the long-term vision, is getting to a place where we can do something like that, or at least attempt to do something like that. But the Heeks roadmap has kind of like what needs to happen first. And one would be like the idea of slots. Surface has this, but if you're familiar with other like Vue, JS, a lot of client-side frameworks have this idea of like in EX or Heeks, you can pass an assign. Like I want to have this label have a title, and then you say like, okay, at title in your EX, like that works. But what if you wanted to say, I want this header like to be able to slot in a bunch of markup? Like you can't do that today in LiveView. So that's something we want to add, where a caller can essentially give you a block of markup, and they're like, I want you to render your header navigation, but within that, I want to say this is the profile drop-down slot, and then I can do whatever I want there, whatever markup or whatnot. So that's something that's required to get to this like componentized, themable future that I would like to experiment with, but follow along on that issue if people are interested in those kind of things.
Cool. Anything else we have on 1.6?
At the moment, try it out, report issues. This far, I think there's been like typo issues, no big problems. It's always like, yeah, you release something and then you're like, this is like eerily quiet. So, I mean, it's been like half a day, but I encourage folks to try it out. I mean, honestly, actually, what usually happens is people wait for the RCs to be over, and then we get issues once we go final. So like people don't actually use the RCs like they're meant to be used, but it's reasonably baked at this point. Like 1.6 has been very close to done for a long time. We've kind of been just solving the Heeks engine side of things. So I think I don't expect a lot of issues, but absolutely the release candidates are for people to try out and make sure things are super ready to go. But I don't expect to see many issues.
Cool. Mike, do you want to talk about your project you've been working on?
Sure. Yeah. So kind of hinted at, I think, at the last roundtable or two, but yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I put out a blog post announcing CobolToElixir, which came out of a kind of a random back and forth what if in the dockyard Slack of what if we could take Elixir and turn it into Cobol. Sorry, take Cobol, turn it into Elixir. And yeah, you don't want to go. Yeah, you wouldn't want to go the other way. So yeah, so the idea being that right now there's like some crazy percent, like 75 or 80% of like all financial transactions still run over Cobol. And so there's a lot of stuff out there that could potentially be upgraded in the near future. And so, you know, what if we could you know, point those that are looking to upgrade towards Elixir, similar to how, you know, the NX stuff is trying to capture some of the machine learning, and, you know, obviously LiveView and Phoenix are capturing the you know, general web stuff. But yeah, so it's kind of well, it started off as a really long shot. It's still a long shot as to whether it'll be successful or not. But it's it's ready to be released out to see if people want to start playing around with it. It has some of the basic features as far as input and output and procedure calls and all that. It will transpile into Elixir. So some pretty big hurdles to get over right now. I'm working on file access, and so taking the COBOL file manipulation idea and pattern and translating that into Elixir so that we can transpile those sort of files. Yeah, and so it's like I said, it's still very early phases. What I do think is what I really like about it so far is that we can take COBOL code, basically the testing framework that was built around it. So you can take COBOL code and inside an Elixir test, you can execute that in COBOL and get the output, and then we can run our own code to convert that to Elixir, and then execute the Elixir code and get the output. And so that testing framework is built. It allows you to send input, and it allows you to get the output, and then compare them all in a couple of helper functions. So yeah, that's where it's at, and just gonna keep moving forward on features for now. If anyone out there is interested in taking a look at this, it's on my my GitHub, just the first Avenger, CobolToElixir, Cobol_2_Elixir, and it's out on Hex. But yeah, and if any companies out there are interested in taking a test ride of it or taking a look at it, reach out. We'd love to chat and see what it would take for that to be something that would be useful.
And the selling point for a lot of these systems, that their financial systems or whatever their kind of infrastructure, that they want to be on a platform that's very reliable, and that's the Beam is built for reliability from the beginning for the phone system, and Elixir is just this beautiful tool set on top of that reliable foundation. So that's why we think it makes sense to move to Elixir specifically, as opposed to moving to, I don't know, Python or something.
Yeah, exactly. You don't stick with a 60 or 70, however many year old language if it's not reliable. That's really, I think, why people have stayed with their existing COBOL systems, because it just works and it just keeps working. But as COBOL engineers become fewer and harder to find, that's eventually they're just going to have to make that jump. And so if we can provide a tool that will get them some of the way there, it's not they're not going to run this and all of a sudden they've got production ready Elixir code. This would be the first step in converting the bulk of their code, but then jump to walk through that Elixir, because you're not creating idiomatic Elixir necessarily. Well, you're not creating idiomatic Elixir, but you're creating Elixir that works. So then your second step after running this would be to go through and then say, okay, this is what it looks like in Elixir, but what would it look like to update this and make this more idiomatic? But you have a functioning set of code. So yeah.
That's cool.
Awesome. Do we know, I'm clueless at how what the COBOL ecosystem looks like integration wise, library wise, but does COBOL, I know IO obviously is the current feature you're working on, but do they talk to databases often? Is there any idea of what that would look like? I mean, obviously the goal is this is a starting point, but do you have any thoughts on off the shelf, is there a ton of legacy database integration that will also have to be solved, or is it standard for COBOL to kind of be on a mainframe somewhere writing to a file, and maybe this database idea is less common?
Yeah. So what's, as far as what's the most common, I don't have information on that. I know what, yes, obviously it'll work with database, and DB2 is like the I want to say is the big one, but there's a lot of flat file manipulation, reading and writing, and so yeah, it's that's some of the work that needs to be done. And again, if there's companies out there that are interested, or would want to work with Dockyard on figuring this stuff out, it'd be great to hear from people. But yeah, right now, again, my first steps are, is it even possible? And so I'm working through that, and if it is, then we can figure out where to focus on yeah, like I said, what libraries, what interactions are being used most that we need to support. So
yeah, and I guess like if your transpiler, even like if it encountered a remote function call and transpiled that to like DB query, and then here's the string of the query, as like obviously that's not just going to go talk to the database, but that would be a good starting point to be like, oh,
yeah,
okay, this is
exactly,
it's extracting all that for you to be like, okay, here are the points now that like I need to make this one part work versus like a from scratch rewrite. So that
right.
makes total sense.
Yeah. So it's the path I have, at least right now, which may change, is there's three parts of it. There's the tokenizer that goes through and basically turns the strings into lists of like tuples and atoms and stuff, to basically say that I understand this code. And then there's the parser that takes that and turns that into basically a module that has a list of all the functions and all the variables and stuff in an Elixir struct. And then there's the Elixirizer that takes that module and turns it into actual Elixir. And so what on each level, the tokenizer doesn't recognize something, it'll kick out a warning and say, I don't know what to do with this. And similarly on the parser. So as part of when you run it, it'll say, hey, this is a feature that I don't know how to deal with. And so if we were to partner with someone or a company that would actually want to do this, the idea there would be that you'd run the code, see what's missing, and then go back and update CobolToElixir to add those features, and then rerun it and kind of iterate on it to improve CobolToElixir, but then make it work better for your specific requirements. So, and then like if there's something that's like, we're just not going to be able to transpile this, we can note it somehow, and then you jump into the generated code and work on it just as if you weren't working with a transpiler, just implement that feature. So it's more of the 80-20 type rule, where we can get a bunch of it moved over and figure out what else needs to get done. So.
Awesome. Do you have any resources that you use for like the tokenizer and the parser? Like I've never written a tokenizer or parser before, so be curious if there's anything.
So
anything that was useful.
Before this project, I haven't either. So I kind of went with a pretty naive approach of splitting the strings and pattern and matching on stuff. That's one of the things that I think actually might be good for me. Once I have a couple more of the features done, is to go back and look and see if there's a better way to actually handle that. Because the way it's being done now might not be really maintainable, and so there, some sort of parser that a better way of defining how things are being parsed. Like I said, it's very.
I know there's like nimble parsec.
Yeah,
whatnot, that may be worth checking out. But yeah, this is kind of all new to me. So
yeah, exactly. It's new to me too. So that's that it might be that nimble parsec is what that becomes. But yeah, again, this is exploratory, and see what sort of interest is out there. All it would take, I think, is one company or one place, one set of code where people would be interested in trying it out, and they can see how it goes.
So I have a question that you know, I guess it comes from a place of knowing absolutely nothing about COBOL other than, you know, what we're taught in like ancient computer history classes now. I see people talk about environments, like not just the COBOL language, but like the environment it runs in being almost as important, if not more so, than the COBOL language itself. Like long-term roadmap, is this, it seems like this would be the, and maybe this goes back to the 80-20 rule, but it seems like this is like the great first step. But have you had a chance to look at all into like some of those different environments and how they cause different COBOL code bases to behave?
I haven't. No, not at this point. At this point, I'm working with the basics. So I have, like, you know, I haven't got into much the integration stuff beyond, like I said, I'm now working with file stuff. And there are, one of the big you know, potential issues is there are lots of different dialects of COBOL, and so being able to adapt to that and handle things that, you know, aren't necessarily the, you know, I'm basing everything right now off of using the GNU, the GNU COBOL compiler, and so that's what I'm building to. But there are, you know, like I said, there's different flavors, and so the question of how much is that going to, how much would we need to tweak the code base to target a specific version of the language or dialect. So that's definitely out there as a thing. And again, you know, like I said, if there are companies out there that are interested, you know, we'd love to see what's actually going on and try it out, see what happens.
I may end up accidentally volunteering some help, but I do have to say Elixirizer is a fantastic name, and I think I'm going to start using it a lot.
That was I was like, oh my god, I know tokenizer and parser, and I'm like, well, what? Sure, you know, why not Elixirizer?
Nice.
Yeah.
Do we have time to do another topic, or should we drop? What do you think, guys?
If we have one, sure.
So I have a little bit of just a kind of experience that I've been learning from. You know, I'm laughing because some of you have heard me rant about this a little bit, but yeah. So pagination is a really common thing that we do in applications. A really common way to do that is, you know, when you're querying records from the database, you do like an offset. You know, you get your records, and the first time it's offset 0, and you know, you get the first 100, and then it's offset 100, and you skip the first 100 and show the next 100, and so on. And that kind of works okay. It works pretty well as a first pass, but there's a couple problems with that. This is a known thing for a long time. One of the things that's a problem with that is it gets more and more inefficient the farther you paginate in. So when you're doing offset 10 million, the database is doing a lot of work to get those records ahead of where you're going, and then it has to discard them. It doesn't really have a better way to do it than that. I know Elle mentioned that index support should help with that some, but it doesn't seem to do a whole lot in my experiments. And the issue is that especially, well, I can't give a great in-depth explanation of why this is the case, but experimentally that doesn't work. And the index is like a B-tree index isn't laid out linearly. I think that's part of it. It's still got to figure out, especially like if you've got sorts and whatever, it's basically got to figure out what's ahead of that one to be able to do the offset. So paging is one issue, and then another issue with paginating is that it can be inconsistent. Like imagine you're sorting records newest to oldest. So you see the newest at the top, and then you go to page 2, so you do offset 100, but in the meantime, some new stuff came in. So now it's like off, and you missed some records, or you saw some records twice, or whatever, as things change. So the standard answer to how to do this better is what's called Keyset pagination. So with Keyset pagination, you make use of your index, and you'll say, like, the first page I showed you up to ID 102, and your next query will be where ID greater than 102, limit 100, or whatever. And that way, if stuff is missing or if stuff has been added, you get a more consistent experience, and it gets to use the indexes much more efficiently. That where condition is the key to that. This is also sometimes called cursor-based pagination, and the reason is because to be able to do that, the user can't just, the user has to send back, hey, the last one that I saw was ID 102, and then you can pick up from there. And that thing they send back to you is called a cursor. So, and typically people want that cursor to be opaque because they don't want the user to have any real knowledge of what's in that. And even if it's just like a base 64 encoded thing, just kind of giving a signal like, don't mess with this. This is none of your business. And so that's a typical kind of solution. The thing that I ran into on the project that we're on is UUIDs. Like a lot of projects, you know, your basic database setup that's most common with Ecto or Active Record or those kinds of tools. You generate a schema and it's got an auto incrementing integer ID on every table, and that's what you do. But sometimes on projects, people want to use a UUID for some records for the reason that they want to have a little bit of obscurity around how many records there are, or how, you know, what the next record might be, so that somebody can't go, oh, I see I'm invoice 200. I know you've gotten 200 invoices in your history, and I wonder what's that invoice 201 or 199. You know, it's like start messing around in your system. So instead, your URL has this giant UUID that they can't possibly guess what another one is with any reliability, and it doesn't give them any information, and that's fine. That is the case on the project that I was on that I'm on right now for some mostly historical reasons. It doesn't actually matter that much for us, but the issue there is when that UUID is your primary key, because unless you go out of your way to find a kind of UUID that is sortable, generally speaking, UUIDs don't sort in any meaningful way. So if you want to do Keyset pagination, that you have to have, to do Keyset pagination, you have to have a column that's sortable and unique. Because imagine it's like you're trying to do this on inserted at, but two records are inserted at the same time. And so the first record shows up as the last one on the first page, and then you say greater than that date time, and you skip the second one when you go to the second page. So you need something that's unique, but it also needs to be ordered in a reasonable way. So we're in the process of setting up a GraphQL API where we need pagination, and we want pagination to be efficient. We want to be able to paginate a lot of records, and so I'm setting up cursor-based Keyset pagination for that, and I've been going through and having to go backfill and switch to integer auto-incrementing IDs on tables that had UUID, and you could, and maybe I should have just added a sequential column without messing with the primary keys and swapping around all the foreign keys and all that business. That would have been less painful. I probably should have done that. But I would like to say that if you're thinking about setting up a project and you're thinking about using UUIDs, I would strongly encourage you to use integer IDs and also have a UUID column if you want that. Even though that seems a little wasteful to have both of them, because you can use the UUID, you can have a unique index on it, you can do your lookups and put that in the URL and everything, but you get the ability to do Keyset pagination. You get the ability to reference things a lot more easily. It's just more easy. It's easier for a human to say record 205 than to read a UUID, and it's easier to type. And also, it's kind of the happy path for tools like Ecto and Active Record and whatever else. So less work to deal with, better ergonomics, and better future proofing for features you're probably going to want. So that's kind of my rant on that. The side rant on that is that with GraphQL, it's not as easy as I would like within Absinthe to do keyset pagination. The standard for pagination in GraphQL seems to be the relay spec, which has quite a bit of. It's interesting. It's got an interesting structure that the user has to request. You know, when you're doing a REST API, you have control over what you send back to the client. But when you're doing a GraphQL API, they're specifying exactly what they want to see. And so if they're going to get that pagination information, they have to type in the structure of how that's going to come back in their query. And the way that it comes back, initially I just looked at it and I was like, I don't understand this at all. Like, this looks really complicated. And now that I've spent some time with it, it makes sense, but it still is kind of complicated. It's like you've got edges and nodes, and then underneath your nodes, you have the records, and then like at the level of the edges, you have the cursors, and it's a lot to look at. And we have a concern that our users of our API aren't going to be familiar with that, and they're going to be like, what is all this boilerplate I have to do just to paginate? So I'm not sure if there's an easier way we can provide for them, but that is kind of the standard way that a lot of tools expect. So we feel like we have to at least provide that way, and maybe we'll have more than one way, but that's a little bit thorny. But the Absinthe relay package by default does limit offset pagination, which makes sense because they don't know anything about your schema. They don't know what what column they could do keyset pagination on. And limit offset will work with any query, but I found it a little bit difficult so far to shoehorn that in, to the point that I'm kind of writing my own module to be able to do it. So that's been an adventure and trying to think through all the scenarios that you can get with pagination, because you can say, give me this many records before this cursor, and take the first number of records after that cursor, or you can say, give me this many records after this cursor and this many records before that cursor. I can't, maybe I didn't say that right. You can do after with first and before with last. So give me the last 200 records before this cursor, which means you have to reverse the order of the query that many records, and then get the results and flip them and reverse them again to hand them back in the right order. And and just thinking through all of the scenarios of all the parameters that can come in and which ones it doesn't make sense to give first and last together. I don't think it makes sense to give before and after together for pagination. So I'm not supporting those things. But the combinations you can have, I used a technique to write this code, which I stumbled into doing at a previous job, which I called blind refactoring guided by tests. So it was like, I got to write this code. It's got to handle all these different scenarios. And I don't understand the underlying unifying logic that makes this make sense. So what I did was, in both of these scenarios, I wrote tests for every possible scenario. And I give it this, I should get this. I give it this, I should get this. And then I wrote a giant pile of conditional code. That's just like every single scenario as a separate condition, copy paste everything, that they have in common and mess around. And then once the tests are passing, then I just start very slowly finding the common bits, refactoring them if the test breaks. I know I messed up, and try again. And maybe just throw away that commit, come back, and then eventually you get to a point where it's like, oh, now I see how it works. And that's beautiful. And I described it I had 4 different function heads that slowly became identical. And at the end, I deleted 3 of them. And I was like, it's like when you get that vertical block in Tetris and the rows disappear. It was nice. But it was even more enlightening in the previous job that I had it, because when I finally got it refactored, it was like the code was explaining to me the actual correct procedure. I was like, now I see what it does and why it works this way. So anyway, I think that's a fun technique to get to apply when you have a scenario for it.
Awesome. Yeah, I take that approach quite often, but like sometimes, like I hit this in live view. This is a couple of versions ago, but like, you smash the keyboard till stuff works, and you're like, it works, awesome, and I can verify that it works, and then you try to make it nice, but sometimes what happens is like I have false starts when actually like making it nice and like, oh, here's the pieces that beautifully put together. And like one time with live view, I took 3 attempts at like making the pile of terribleness like correct, and failed 3 times, but in the same exact ways. It was like, try to make it pretty, get lost with what I'm doing. It's not getting better. Revert back to where I started. 3 hours later, okay, I'm gonna do it right this time. And I end up like taking the same exact path that I took previously. I don't know if you've ever gone down this, but like I did it with live view three separate times, 3 attempts. I ended up like going down the same exact path where I was like, what the heck? Like my brain just couldn't like I didn't think I was doing it, but by the time I look up from the keyboard, it's like, wait, this is exactly what I did. But in general, I really like that approach of like first make it work, and then like figure out how to actually make it be nice and maintainable. Absolutely is the way to go versus trying to make it perfect from the outset, when half the time, yeah, you don't really even realize exactly what you're building.
Yeah, that's CobolToElixir. It's getting it to work and tweaking it, and then taking a step, take a step back and say, what does this actually look like from a higher level? The original problem was the pagination, right? And the issue with UUIDs was that there's a potential that if they're inserted at the same time that they could flip. But what if your pagination was that you sent the UUID for since, like I want the next 20 since this one, but your sorting was inserted at and UUID. So then you would always have a guaranteed order, even with a collision on time, that would be guaranteed across requests.
Yeah. Let's see. That might work great, actually. I'd have to think about it some more, and it would be funny if I did all this work and I didn't need to. But yeah, I think that could work. I mean, one of the things that you have to make sure of with this is that you have your indexes set up correctly.
Right.
I looked at approaches where you sort by where you do where so your cursor has to, I think your cursor has to include both of the values, but maybe it doesn't. Now that you're saying this, I'm questioning myself. I was thinking your cursor had to include both of the columns that you were sorting by. But since you've got a UUID, I don't see why it would. People sometimes have done approaches where you have like a tuple that you build, like where last name ID as a tuple is greater than this cursor last name ID. And that gets really hairy for index support, because then you have to index by that tuple as well. And then if you want to reverse paginate efficiently, you have to index by that tuple in reverse. And then any other column you want to sort by, you have to do that as well. And that's just a mess.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm looking at it as a separation of concerns, right? The real issue is that the order isn't correct, or the order could potentially flip. And so if that's the only problem, then on the at the database level, if you're the problem is that order isn't guaranteed. So the question is, how do you guarantee order? And that would be by sorting on the second field, and that could be at the lowest level. And I mean, my first thing would be to say, does as far as how the database actually behaves, is it in practice actually going to flip them? If you request things from a database and you sort by an inserted at, and there's 2 exactly the same inserted at, is it going to, you might say you might not want to rely on that, but in practice, it might actually return it every time.
You don't want to rely on that. We actually have flaky tests sometimes where
Okay.
a sort order isn't specified. With any SQL database, if you don't specify a sort order, you just don't know. I mean,
Okay, yeah. Then in that case, definitely.
It's worth pointing out the Chris Keithley has a HL clock library, which is hybrid logical clocks, and there's a HL clock ecto library, which Postgres can. It's ecto type for a hybrid logical clock, which is essentially like a UUID with a timestamp that is globally unique. So this is something maybe that could also be considered, where it's like it's guaranteed to be orderable, even if multiple writers like inserted at the same time. It's going to be sortable and indexable by Postgres. It may or may not be like, it may be overkill for what folks need, but it's at least worth pointing that out. It solves this problem of like your inserted at wouldn't be used. Like the UUID itself carries a timestamp basically as part of it, and it's going to be it's going to have it's going to not have conflicts with other writers, with some caveats that like there's like a 60,000 operations per second maximum before there's a time collision. And bringing that up, like the only other thing I wanted to call out, I don't think it applies here, Nathan. So like I don't want to be like, oh well, if you're building a distributed system. So I think what you said about pagination and integer IDs totally makes sense. I mean, I use integer IDs by default as well. But I at least want to call out like the other thing that we haven't talked about is like UUIDs are really good for global uniqueness. So like if you have multiple writers in a distributed system, that like if the client basically allows the client to control the ID, when that's advantageous because multiple clients can do something and then you could then later write it to Postgres, and you have to figure out like, well, who won? It could be the last write wins, or you could use something like hybrid logical clocks where you would actually be able to figure out who actually won that. But that's, like I said, totally another topic. It's just since we're on the HL clock stuff, I wanted to call that out, that UUIDs are really good for like obscuring the URL, but also for global uniqueness.
For me, the other thing that pushes me towards the UUIDs is as basic as if I'm testing and I need to reset the database, if my seeds can have the same IDs and not be, that I on my current project, I've had that be super helpful. That I've got a live view page I'm working on, and the UUIDs right in there. And if I mix ecto reset, I'm working on an entity that's in the seed, so it's still there when I refresh. So small thing.
So Mike, I think, and it's hard for me to, I'm like intimidated to do this on the fly because I've stared at this stuff a whole bunch, and I'm like, I'm probably gonna get this wrong on the air now. But the thing with the UUID that you're describing, yeah, you can have UUID be a tiebreaker for a non-unique field like an inserted at. But so like if you have midnight and then the UUID is AAA, right? And then obviously it's longer, but let's just pretend. And then you have another midnight CCC. By the timestamps, there's no ordering, but the UUID then breaks that tie. So that works for sorting. But then you could have a 1 a.m. AAA or AAB, let's say, right? And so then you say, okay, where UUID is greater than CCC.
No, you would say it wouldn't be where UUID. It would just be select from. You would say. Let's see. No, I'm trying to think.
It has to be where it's not that ID. Like you want to exclude it. But it's got to be determined.
What would be the where?
You can't.
What's
you can't. Your where not in will get you the non-dupe result, but you have to have something that you can sort on. Otherwise, all bets are off.
So that doesn't fix it. Yeah, it fixes. It gives you guaranteed ordering, but you can't say where it's greater than that. You want to say where. Yeah,
you want to be able to say where
order it's greater.
Yeah, you want to be able to say where timestamp comma UUID is greater than midnight comma CCC, and that works. But then you have indexing is painful for that kind of thing.
Yeah, really what you want is you want to say where it's greater than this specific record.
Exactly.
In greater meaning based on this sort where it's after this item. And it's too late on a Friday for me to connect the dots there.
So the easiest scenario.
I'm trying to like put my head to this problem too, and it's like, there's like the last 10%. You're like, my brain's not working.
Yeah, the scenario that like is easiest to understand and makes the most sense is just you have the sequential ID. You know, you saw record 50 last, and then you just say where greater than 50 limit 50, and that works beautifully. But anything other than sorting by that column and keying off of that column, it starts to become kind of either hard to implement or hard to understand.
So this will work. You make your insert of that unique, and on collision you just add a millisecond, add a second, and just so that would punt the issue.
That would.
Until then, of course, you get 60,000 records in a second, and all of a sudden they're listed as.
I'm saying like
half an hour late.
It's like you're like you're like implementing hyperlogical clock, and then you're like, wait a second,
right?
Like, but then what happens if you had? And then you're like, oh, like this is someone did solve this, and if there's constraints. But
well, actually, I wonder. So, joking around, but if you're really dealing with cases where you're only inserting like once, something every, and I don't know what the situation you're dealing with, but if you're inserting a record every hour or two, you could have it fail the change set and retry, right? Like
totally,
it all depends what you're building. That's why I said I didn't want to be like I was being pedantic, like, oh well, this wouldn't work for this really esoteric thing. So it's like I'm sure for like the use case that Nathan has, like I said, integer columns, like that's all you need, like ship it. But it's like if you have like distributed system with a bunch of people trying to do like concurrent operations that you would then want to the answer is like Postgres could just solve this because you just do it in a transaction and the database like ensures ordering and uniqueness. But if you wanted to have like different things happening and then record that in Postgres later and then figure out who won, hyperlogical clocks would give you that. But it's like we're going down a rabbit hole of like that applies for a very specific use case of things happening externally that you then record the history of. And a lot of people don't need to solve those kinds of problems.
Yeah, I think the key thing for this is you just want something that's orderable, which is guaranteed unique. And so anything that you can use that gets you that, it doesn't even have to be the primary key. You could have a UUID primary key and a separate sequence column that you add later that you do this stuff with. And if you want to do that sequence as a timestamp that is guaranteed unique somehow, that works just fine. But you have to have those properties somehow. And I feel like if you're gonna have a UUID, but you're also gonna have a unique sequence number, which one of those do you want to be your primary key? I just think it's more convenient to have the sequence be your primary key.
I mean, like I said, I totally agree, especially like if you don't need the UUID for the specific reasons we talked about. If like all you have is like, I want to obscure a guessable URL, then like you said, Nathan, just add a UUID column and add an index for it. Like I forget like what the big int maximum is. So like it's worth calling out just for the comments. Someone will be like, oh well, there's I forget like what's the maximum number of a big int in Postgres. So like if you have specific requirements where integer sequence is a non-starter, then obviously you have this problem. But I think many of us do not have whatever that maximum is. Someone should look it up.
Big int. Oh gosh,
8
how am I gonna
bytes
read that number?
Big int, right? Giant number. That's without commas. I'm not going to guess.
One,
so it's
2,
like
3.
So I guess maybe this proves Nathan's point then. Like unless you have this distributed system problem, like it's probably not something that someone's ever going to hit for the vast majority of use cases.
Yeah. It's funny how something like I put a comment in our Slack channel like, do you know how to do pagination? Hey, I'm a senior software engineer. Of course I know how to do pagination. And then I start looking at it, I'm like, holy cow, there's a lot to this.
Yeah, it's like that's actually amazing because yeah, I mean you can. It all depends on the requirements though. Like there's a lot of nuance there. Where it's like I think the only pagination I've ever done, at least for like we're talking like displaying results on a web page, is like the naive approach that you're talking about. It's all you ever need, right? Wrong.
Yeah.
It's like
another.
off, you know,
we don't
like,
have to go down this.
off plenty of times until
we don't have to go
the
down this rabbit
requirements
hole.
are hard.
Sorry, I mean to talk over you. We don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but I had a request at one client. It was a recipe site, and they wanted like every time somebody showed up, they wanted them to get like a random ordering of recipes, but then they had to be able to infinite scroll and continue in that random order. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting problem to solve. And kind of similarly
like
with
the entire result set is random.
Well, they ended up saying like it doesn't
order
have to be
order by rand, but then like also paginate over
seed,
that.
Yeah. Seed.
Okay, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Now I'm like,
it didn't. Okay, so it didn't have to be actually random. It just had to be like you're not going to see the same order every time you show up.
So I was gonna say otherwise, other than keeping like a dead letter of like IDs that you've seen, like how would that?
You generate a seed. You use the seed. You store a seed. I'm thinking, you know, there's a live view or whatever. On mount, you generate a seed, and you use that seed to randomize the list.
Well, that you'd have to fetch everything from the database into Elixir though.
Yeah. Well,
like, can you tell Postgres what seed to use, and then you just have an offset? But anyway, that's actually like you said, Nathan. That's actually a really interesting problem. It is funny though. Like this is like the client requirements. Like it's one of those things that like it sounds like that should be like a very easy thing, right? Like just you order the results on a web page, and like as a programmer, it's actually interesting where you're like, actually, it's gonna be like 2 weeks of work.
Insert like add like 10 different columns and just insert random UUIDs in all of them, and you pick which column you're sorting on.
You know, I actually think that is a really good solution.
You get at most 10 random. You know, for every column you put in, you'd get a different order. But
exactly, yeah, I think that would actually work pretty well. If you want it to be repeatable and all this stuff, like another possibility is, and I think I actually don't remember how I solved this in this case, but I think that it was something along those lines where there were just a limited number of possible shuffling orders. If you don't have actually a huge ton of records, you could generate the IDs, like pull the IDs from the database, shuffle them in memory, and hold them in their session, and then just get the records in that order.
I think
using
it's
live
a million ways to do it.
Yeah, depending on the result set. Yeah, you could just do like a select ID on mount, and then you just like select slices of that. I mean, like it's not a whole lot of memory, so yeah, it really depends. But it's an interesting problem.
When we did Phoenix Frenzy, I actually did something kind of like this because I wanted to make sure that when you showed up to vote, the orders were randomized, the entries were randomized, because I didn't want somebody getting more votes just because they happen to be at the top of the page. But every time you did anything on the page, it was re-rendering. So I had to make sure it re-rendered with the same order, or like every time you touch the page, it would scramble. So in that case, I think I actually did just keep the IDs in memory, because I mean, there were like, you know, tens of entries, not millions. So that was fun, but also just learning how to do the Postgres query where you actually tell it in this order specifically was a kind of an adventure. All right, well that was my whole rant topic. Anybody got anything else you want to talk about before we wrap it up? All right, cool. Well, it was fun talking with y'all. Hope you have a good afternoon, and catch you later.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.